When I was 16, the region decided that it was time that I became a man. In Zusa tradition, this is achieved through one means only circumcision. In my tradition, an uncircumcised male cannot be heir to his father's wealth, cannot marry or officiate in tribal rituals. An uncircumcised Zusa man is a contradiction in terms, for he is not considered a man at all, but a boy. For the Zuja people, circumcision represents the formal incorporation of males into society. It is not just a surgical procedure, but a lengthy and elaborate ritual in preparation for manhood. As a Zuja, I count my years as a man from the date of my circumcision. The traditional ceremony of the circumcision school was arranged principally for justice. The rest of us, 26 in all, were there mainly to keep him company. Early in the new year, we journeyed to two grass huts in a secluded valley on the banks of the Mabashi River known as Teaharla, the traditional place of circumcision for Thambu kings. The huts were seclusion lodges where we were to live isolated from society. It was a sacred time. I felt happy and fulfilled taking part in my people's customs and ready to make the transition from boyhood to manhood. We had moved to Teolharla by the river a few days before the actual circumcision ceremony. These last days of boyhood were spent with the other initiates, and I found the camaraderie enjoyable. The lodge was near the home of Banak Baki Balai, the wealthiest and most popular boy at the circumcision school. He was an engaging fellow, a champion stick fighter, and a glamour boy, whose many girlfriends kept us all supplied with delicacies. Although he could neither read nor write, he was one of the most intelligent among us. He regaled us with stories of his trips to Johannesburg, a place that none of us had ever been to. He so thrilled us with tales of the mines that he almost persuaded me that to be a miner was more alluring than to be a monarch. Miners had a mystique. To be a miner meant to be strong and daring, the ideal of manhood. Much later, I realized that it was the exaggerated tales of boys like Banapakpe that caused so many young men to run away to work in the mines of Johannesburg, where they often lost their health and their lives. In those days, working in the mines was almost as much of a rite of passage as circumcision school, a myth that helped the mine owners more than it helped my people. A custom of circumcision school is that one must perform a daring exploit before the ceremony. In days of old, this might have involved a cattle raid or even a battle, but in our time, the deeds were more mischievous than martial. 2 nights before we moved to Teolharla, we decided to steal a pig. In Mikisveni, there was a tribesman with a typical old pig. To avoid making a noise and alarming the farmer, we arranged for the pig to do our work for us. We took handfuls of sediment from homemade African beer, which has a strong scent much favored by pigs, and placed it upwind of the animal. It was so aroused by the scent that it came out of the kraal, following a trail we had laid, and gradually made his way to us, wheezing and snorting, and eating the sediment. When he got near us, we captured the poor pig, slaughtered it, and then built a fire and ate roast pork underneath the stars. No piece of pork has ever tasted so good before or since. The night before the circumcision, there was a ceremony near our huts with singing and dancing. Women came from the nearby villages and we danced to their singing and clapping. As the music became faster and louder, our dance turned more frenzied and we forgot for a moment what lay ahead. At dawn, when the stars were still in the sky, we began our preparations. We were escorted to the river to bathe in its cold waters, a ritual that signified our purification before the ceremony. The ceremony was at midday, and we were commanded to stand in a row in a clearing some distance from the river, where a crowd of parents and relatives, including the regent, as well as a handful of chiefs and councillors, had gathered. We were clad only in our blankets, and as the ceremony began, with drums pounding, we were ordered to sit on a blanket on the ground with our legs spread out in front of us. I was tense and anxious, uncertain of how I would react when the critical moment came. Flinching or crying out was a sign of weakness and stigmatized one's manhood. I was determined not to disgrace myself, the group, or my guardian. Circumcision is a trial of bravery and stoicism. No anesthetic is used. A man must suffer in silence. To the right, out of the corner of my eye, I could see a thin elderly man emerge from a tent and kneel in front of the first boy. There was excitement in the crowd, and I shuddered slightly. Knowing that the ritual was about to begin, the old man was a famous Ingsivi, our circumcision expert from Glecaland, who would use his assegai to change us from boys to men with a single blow. Suddenly, I heard the first boy cry out, Nidinyan Doda, I am a man, which we had been trained to say at the moment of circumcision. Seconds later, I heard Justice's strangled voice pronounce the same phrase. There were now two boys before the Insibi reached me, and my mind must have gone blank because before I knew it, the old man was kneeling in front of me. I looked directly into his eyes. He was pale, and though the day was cold, his face was shining with perspiration. His hands moved so fast, they seemed to be controlled by an otherworldly force. Without a word, he took my foreskin, pulled it forward, and then, in a sudden motion, brought down his assegai. I felt as if fire was shooting through my veins. The pain was so intense that I buried my chin in my chest. Many seconds seemed to pass before I remembered the cry, and then I recovered and called out, Nidiyan Dova. I looked down and saw a perfect cut, clean and round like a ring. But I felt ashamed because the other boys seemed much stronger and firmer than I had been. They had called out more promptly than I had. I was distressed that I had been disabled, however briefly, by the pain, and I did my best to hide my agony. A boy may cry, a man conceals his pain. I had now taken the essential step in the life of every Zuja man. Now I might marry, set up my own home, and plough my own field. I could now be admitted to the councils of the community. My words would be taken seriously. At the ceremony, I was giving my circumcision name Dalimbhunga, meaning founder of the Bunga, the traditional ruling body of the Transkei. To Zuja traditionalist, this name is more acceptable than either of my two previous given names, Rohilla or Nelson, and I was proud to hear my new name pronounced Dalibunga. Immediately after the blow had been delivered, an assistant who followed the circumcision master took the foreskin that was on the ground and tied it to a corner of our blankets. Our wounds were then dressed with a healing plant, the leaves of which were thorny on the outside but smooth on the inside, which absorbed the blood and other secretions. At the conclusion of the ceremony, we returned to our huts, where a fire was burning with wet wood that cast off clouds of smoke, which was thought to promote healing. We were ordered to lie on our backs in the smoky huts, with one leg flat and one leg bent. We were now Avakwita, initiates into the world of manhood. We were looked after by an Amakhankhata, or guardian, who explained the rules we had to follow if we were to enter manhood properly. The first chore of the Amakhantha was to paint our naked and shaved bodies from head to toe in white ochre, turning us into ghosts. The white chalk symbolized our purity, and I still recall how stiff the dried clay felt on my body. That first night at midnight, an attendant, or Ikhankhatha, crept around the hut, gently waking each of us. We were then instructed to leave the hut and go tramping through the night to bury our foreskins. The traditional reason for this practice was so that our foreskins would be hidden before wizards could use them for evil purposes. But symbolically, we were also burying our youth. I did not want to leave the warm hut and wander through the bush in the darkness, but I walked into the trees and after a few minutes untied my foreskin and buried it into the earth. I felt as though I had now discarded the last remnant of my childhood. We lived in our 2 huts, 13 in each, while our wounds healed. When outside the huts, we were covered in blankets, for we were not allowed to be seen by women. It was a period of quietude, a kind of spiritual preparation for the trials of manhood that lay ahead. On the day of our re-emergence, we went down to the river early in the morning to wash away the white ochre in the waters of the Mabashi. Once we were clean and dry, we were coated in red ochre. The tradition was that one should keep with a woman who later might become one's wife, and she rubs off the pigment with her body. In my case, however, the ochre was removed with a mixture of fat and lard. At the end of our seclusion, the lodges and all their contents were burned, destroying our last links to childhood, and a great ceremony was held to welcome us as men to society. Our families, friends, and local chiefs gathered for speeches, songs, and gift giving. I was giving 2 heifers and 4 sheep, and felt far richer than I ever had before. I, who had never owned anything, suddenly possessed property. It was a heady feeling, even though my gifts were paltry next to those of Justice, who inherited an entire herd. I was not jealous of Justice's gifts. He was the son of a king. I was merely destined to be a counselor to a king. I felt strong and proud that day. I remember walking differently on that day, straighter, taller, firmer. I was hopeful and thinking that I might someday have wealth, property, and status. The main speaker of the day was Chief Melikkili, the son of Delindebo, and after listening to him, my gaily colored dream suddenly darkened. He began conventionally, remarking how fine it was that we were continuing a tradition that had been going on for as long as anyone could remember. Then he turned to us and his tone suddenly changed. "There, sit our sons," he said, "young, healthy and handsome, the flower of the Zusa tribe, the pride of our nation. We have just circumcised them in a ritual that promises them manhood. But I am here to tell you that it is an empty, illusory promise, a promise that can never be fulfilled. For we Zuzas and all black South Africans are a conquered people. We are slaves in our own country. We are tenants on our own soil. We have no strength, no power, no control over our own destiny in the land of our birth. They will go to cities where they will live in shacks and drink cheap alcohol, all because we have no land to give them where they could prosper and multiply. They will cough their lungs out deep in the bowels of the white man's minds, destroying their health, never seeing the sun, so that the white man can live a life of unequaled prosperity. Among these young men are chiefs who will never rule because we have no power to govern ourselves, soldiers who will never fight, for we have no weapons to fight with, scholars who will never teach because we have no place for them to study. The abilities, the intelligence, the promise of these young men will be squandered in their attempt to eke out a living doing the simplest, most mindless chores for the white man. These gifts today are not, for we cannot give them the greatest gift of all, which is freedom and independence. I well now know that Kamata, God, is all-seeing and never sleeps, but I have a suspicion that Kamata may in fact be dozing. If this is the case, the sooner I die the better, because then I can meet him and shake him awake and tell him that the children of Negumenchuka, the flower of the Zusa nation, are dying. The audience had become more and more quiet as Chief Melikkili spoke, and I think more and more angry. No one wanted to hear the words that he spoke that day. I know that I myself did not want to hear them. I was cross rather than aroused by the chief's remarks, dismissing his words as the abusive comments of an ignorant man who was unable to appreciate the value of the education and benefits that the white man had brought to our country. At the time, I looked on the white man not as an oppressor but as a benefactor, and I thought the chief was enormously ungrateful. This upstart chief was ruining my day, spoiling the proud feeling with wrong-headed remarks. But without exactly understanding why, his words soon began to work on me. He had sown a seed, And though I let that seed lie dormant for a long season, it eventually began to grow. Later, I realized that the ignorant man that day was not the chief but myself. After the ceremony, I walked back to the river and watched it meander on its way to where, many miles distant, it emptied into the Indian Ocean. I had never crossed that river and I knew little or nothing of the world beyond it, a world that beckoned me that day. It was almost sunset, and I hurried on to where our seclusion lodges had been. Though it was forbidden to look back while the lodges were burning, I could not resist. When I reached the area, all that remained were two pyramids of ashes by a large mimosa tree. In these ash heaps lay a lost and delightful world, the world of my childhood, the world of sweet and irresponsible days at Kunu and Megasveni. Now I was a man and I would never again play thinty or steal maize or drink milk from a cow's udder. I was already in mourning for my own youth. Looking back, I know that I was not a man that day and would not truly become one for many years.